sometimes as psychology.
I think the price of cost as one of the reasons was a God experience. Wanted to find God, simply feeling like you're in fire. It isn't always so.
Tell us about the solution.
As one of
With 18 to 35 years of age, not out of work. Hey, I don't have the skills for this particular problem to solve this particular problem.
None of us talked about the bread salad.
Welcome to this episode of The Heart of the Matter, where we will be talking to our guest today, Dr. Mrs. Orode Doherty. She is the country director for Nigeria of Africare, which is an international NGO. She also is a medical doctor, a pediatrician. That's her specialty. So you're welcome to The Heart of the Matter.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, many people might not have heard about Africare. Tell us, what is it that Africa actually does, both in Africa and Nigeria in particular?
So Africare, as you mentioned, is an international non-profit that was established in 1970 in response to the drought in the Sahel. Initially, work started in Niger, in Mali, and in Chad. Really was medical response, blankets, water, food, and humanitarian assistance. And then it quickly evolved into sustainable development, so agriculture for nutrition. And so today, in Nigeria, we came into Nigeria in 1978 and really have been a very health-focused
So you've been in Nigeria
NGO.
for quite a while,
Yes,
1978. Okay.
since 1978, and really have been a very health-focused non-profit organization. So all over Africa today, Africare is the first, the oldest non-profit that's solely focused on the African continent, and our work involves agriculture and food security, nutrition, health, economic empowerment, especially around women and young people.
Okay, now, because you focus on Nigeria, do you have a grasp of what's happening in other parts of Africa?
Absolutely. We have a grasp on what's happening. As Africa country director, I have a grasp on what's happening in all the other countries where we are now, because we have regular come-togethers. We have a weekly and monthly meetings and across country directors and people who are in charge of various country programs. But in addition to that, just because every country on the continent is in one way or the other related, we tend to follow, political, economic and financial, as well as, of course, the development issues in those countries. So
Okay,
yes.
so what are the challenges? I mean, let's talk about challenges first, because I know that there are many benefits. But what are the challenges that you face in some of the countries that Africa is?
So I think for the most part, the challenges are where we sort of see the opportunities. And education for young people has been a real challenge that cuts across the continent, with the exception of a few countries. A large proportion of African youth, and you know that up to 50% of the people on the African continent are young people. The large proportion of them are uneducated or incompletely educated. And so that's one of the issues. So even having people who can do all the work that we
So
would
when
like
you
to
say
do.
uneducated, that means they don't have any schooling whatsoever.
Well, schooling to the extent that we need it in order for us to drive development, especially in rural areas, right? So there's been a huge urban drift, but even then, people in rural areas and in the urban areas where you have these large populations still need to have one sort of development assistance or another. So that's one major challenge. And then access and infrastructure. I think that for us, one of the things we've always joked about is that Africare's work starts where the road ends. Well, very many roads end prematurely, so we find ourselves doing a lot of rural work, but also even now, especially in Nigeria, starting to focus on the high-density urban settlements where people from rural areas migrate to. So two major things: education, access, and infrastructure. And infrastructure can be everything from access to electricity, and then access in all its ramifications.
Okay, so you have your Wellington boots, and you go into rural areas. But I hear a lot of talk about agriculture and new types of new ways of doing farming. Is Africare involved in this?
Yes. So one of the things about the work that Africare does is that a lot of the time we have to identify where pain points are for specific communities. So we're not only listening to our beneficiaries, we're also listening to the donors. And a lot of the time, donors have had sort of worldwide, countrywide, maybe continent-wide conversations, and people begin to think about development priorities. And so when they want to drive those priorities, they go to whom they refer to as tested and trusted, people whom they've worked with, to also listen to what, this is what we're hearing. Is that the same thing you're hearing? Here's what the research is showing. Is this what you're finding on the ground? And then beginning to drive some of these sometimes innovative techniques, sometimes even testing. Because we may find, for example, a certain form of technology works in a certain place. And then you want to see if you can scale it to another country, for example, and you may find that there's actually something that needs to be tweaked in order for it to be deployed successfully in this place. So it's not always the case that things can roll from one country to another, but most definitely we are able to, as much as we are needing to, roll them out. And so we cross-collaborate, we find out what's going on there, we sometimes engage, and sometimes we just test something new.
You also mentioned empowerment, and you talked specifically about women. So before I ask about empowerment, why is it better, or why do you find it better to empower the women as opposed to the men?
So, a couple of things. My bias, obviously, because I'm a pediatrician, I tended to work with women. And it's not necessarily so much that it's better to empower the women, as what data shows is that women who, for example, complete a secondary education are less likely to have children who die under the age of 5 from preventable diseases. So there's a gap there that if we closed, we would be able to solve very many problems. They wouldn't even rear their heads. And then increasingly, it's clear that some women have no access just because they're not aware. And sometimes when they're aware, their husbands may not be aware, their spouses or their families may not be aware. And these are the deterrents or the determinants or the promoters. So while we focus a lot on ensuring that the women are actively supported, increasingly, because of what we've learned over the years, we're also now focusing on making sure that communities, husbands, families are better informed in order to propel the women into taking the action that they need to. So I wouldn't always say better to empower the women, but we certainly get into our space by targeting the women and then reaching out very quickly to their partners.
A few other NGOs that work in empowerment have found that women are more reliable to actually do the project and to repay, because repayment, when you've given money, helps to empower other people. So that was why I asked the question.
Yes.
But are you seeing this as well?
Yes, women are reliable when it comes to repayment. Women will start a business. If they took a loan, they will repay. It's not always the case that there's money involved. Sometimes it's your time and investing your time in that process. A lot of the time, when people have focused on making sure that women build up a business and repay, it may then end up being that the woman has no actual control over her money. And having learned that, we've gone back to saying it's not enough to ensure the woman has access, knows how to repay, and she repays, because what then happens is that the repercussions of that may be that she still doesn't have access to that money. And so it's, until a few years ago, I think many of us were very focused on making sure, address the women, identify the women, make sure the women are getting into it. But we were also finding that the outcomes weren't necessarily changing to the extent that we hoped that they would. And so, yes, the women were repaying, but even when they were building those businesses, it wasn't always the case that outcomes were improving. And so, back to the drawing board, asking the question and then identifying the need for the woman to have agency. And so when we work with women now, we're not only, we start with the women, but we very quickly bring in the rest of the community to say, so the idea behind this is these are the outcomes we would like to see. This, it kind of sounds good that there'll be more money in her pocket, but it's not really money for her to put in her pocket. There's other things that are also going on. And it's a bigger view than that we take.
Okay, now, what about the empowerment itself? How do you generally empower? Why are you going in to empower people?
So, You know, a lot of the time, you start by asking yourself, what are we doing? I'll give you an example. Is one of the data. 98,000 women every year in Nigeria die as a result of exposure to firewood and or other toxic
To firewood?
fuels.
Oh, wow.
Cooking from firewood, which is a lot of
That
women.
doesn't include diesel fumes
So
from
that's
generators.
women who are cooking. So
In the
these
rural
women
areas.
are cooking in the urban areas too. In Ikorodu, in Oshodi, in Agege, in Surulere. They're cooking over open fire and they die as a result. This is not sick. These women die, 98,000 every year in Nigeria, die as a result of exposure. So the question then is, why are they cooking with firewood when there are cleaner fuels that they could use? And we know that firewood causes problems, charcoal takes a long time and causes problems, kerosene also causes problems. But Nigeria is a gas nation. So we have the 9th largest reserve of gas in the world, 6th on the African continent. Why are our women not using cooking gas? Why are they using firewood? Well, there's awareness. First of all, they don't know. People think gas is more expensive than the other available fuels, but when the women sit together and they do the math themselves, they tell you gas is cheaper. And because they realize that gas is cheaper, the next thing is, now that I know that gas is cheaper, well, I want to obtain a gas cylinder. I'd like to purchase gas. I'd like to start using gas to cook. How do I go about it? Then they need to know where to go, what's a safe cylinder to purchase, how do I light a gas cylinder? Many of them are how many generations of never having, always having used firewood. So you got to teach them. And that's a form of empowerment. Now, I haven't given that woman any money. She has used her own money. The same money should have used to purchase charcoal or firewood or kerosene to purchase a gas cylinder. Her lungs are healthier. She's less likely to have premature babies. Her kitchen is nicer looking. And all I did was bring information to her that she sat on and chewed over. So empowerment isn't necessarily always starting a business. It may just be changing the way they do things. Now, what then happens is if 6,000 women over 3 or 4 streets who used to use firewood before now start to use cooking gas, guess what? The environment is cleaner. The children who used to have regular asthma attacks no longer do. Preterm babies are no longer being born preterm. Babies are being carried to term. And women themselves, their blood pressures are better, their skin looks better, their hair looks better, nice, they look nicer. Everybody wins. But first you've got to take that information to them.
Well, let's move to sustainability. And just before we start talking sustainability, we're just going to have a short break. Viewers, please stay tuned to The Heart of the Matter, where we're talking with Dr. Mrs. Orode Doherty, and we'll be back in a moment.
This book, even after touring many cities in the world, impacting lives, telling my story, I was still very ashamed. I was thinking to myself, what were people saying? What were people thinking? Certain people stayed away. I was ashamed. Until one day, I had a conversation with my mentor that changed everything for me. She said, Umi, the people who will hate your book are people who are angry because they feel that he saved you, but he did not save them. Then it hits me. He saved me. It hits me that regardless of what anybody thinks or says, he saved me. And he wants to save you too. The Richer Woman is my story, and I am ready to share it with the world. I'd also like to give a new book to a university student for every book that is bought. Kindly support by buying a copy of The Richer Woman and change someone's life.
Welcome back to the Heart of the Matter, where we're talking to the Country Director for Nigeria of Africare, Dr. Mrs. Orode Doherty. I hope I've got the name right this time. But just before we went on a break, I talked about the fact that we need to talk about sustainability, because it's something that we're hearing all the time. Now, just take Nigeria, and this is true of many other African countries. We've got sea and waves, we've got wind, we've got the sun, and yet we still have power cuts. We still have problems getting the water out of the ground, and so on. What is Africa doing about sustainability? And I know that you've got a wide range of things going on in Africa.
One of the things about sustainability is that you can't start to think about it at the end of your intervention. It's got to be something you build from the beginning with a view to ensuring that when you step back from the situation, it can carry on. So we're talking about cooking gas. One of the things that we have done consistently, and that we're finally now working with the newly created Office of the Vice President on LPG, to say we do not purchase cylinders for anybody. We direct people, having given them information and helped move their behavior along a certain continuum. Because once you start to prioritize something, then you pay for it. Mm-hmm. So if we do that at the level of every intervention, make this thing become important for you. So prioritize immunizing your children, prioritize getting a well visit or a well check, prioritize sending your children to school, prioritize using a clean cooking fuel. Then what happens is that the individuals who are capable of doing so will rise to the occasion, and then there will always be the bottom 3, 7, 10%, where this is where governments and non-profits with aid and support come in. But you know, the way aid is not necessarily money that comes from outside the country. Government can provide aid to its own citizens within the country in form of grants. In addition, enterprise. So if I have an entrepreneurial venture of any kind, I may say that if persons come to me, for example, and they're unable to pay, I will always waive a registration fee. That's a form of aid. But it's important to start something knowing that you don't want to create an entitlement culture. You want to create a behavior that seeks to do the better and the better for the individual. And that means prioritizing the things that help keep you healthy. So Africare, the way we always start is we don't necessarily always start with the base of the pyramid, although we target the bottom of the pyramid. I always start with there's a base and then there's the bottom. And the bottom, usually people can afford these things, they just need to think about them. And then once you've identified those people who are capable of making payments in one way, shape or form, and it is not always in money form, it may be in kind, then you can begin to provide additionally for those who are at the base. So sustainability has to be inbuilt in everything that we're doing. When we provide seed, we always ensure that at the end of your harvest, you're going to take you will have your seed for planting the next season, and then you will have your crop that you will sell and take to market. And we will always encourage you to keep something for the children who are malnourished in that community, who cannot otherwise feed and whose parents can't afford it. That way, there's internally generated aid, there's the money you're getting from your proceeds, and then there's something enough for the next season. Now,
we know that almost everybody in Nigeria has some malaria parasites in their body, and it has become normal for people to self-diagnose and then self-treat. What are the problems with this?
Well, the issue with self-treatment is that we've gone from having chloroquine-sensitive malaria to now chloroquine-resistant malaria. And across the country now, our first line of treatment is the artemisinin combination treatment, which means we no longer would give you chloroquine anymore. We give you ACT right away. Unfortunately, that's all that we have to treat malaria. We obviously have quinine for severe malaria, and we have artemether injections also for severe malaria. But, you know, oral, it's got to be ACT. Now, the reason has not just been that people self-treat, but also that doctors don't necessarily follow the rules. Doctors, nurses, pharmacists, health technicians, people who you see and whom you say, I have a fever, I have this, that, and the other. And we saw this in the results in the past, where you would go to a health facility, you know, and you saw far many more people had been treated than had either been tested or had been positive. And so Africare's response to this, after sort of 2 years of really tug of war going back and forth and really trying to understand why were people treating. Well, the doctors didn't believe the tests. We had introduced a rapid diagnostic test after very many years of the policy.
Africa introduced this?
No. The country, Nigeria, had introduced a rapid diagnostic test. We went to a new algorithm for managing fever, where we said, first, if you have a fever, first you must test before you treat for malaria, especially because we had now developed chloroquine resistance. The problem was people were used to doing things in the way we had told them to in the past, which was when you see a fever, treat for malaria first, then ask questions later. So you're trying to change the behavior of people whom you have told for several decades to now do a test before they treat for malaria. And nobody was going to do that. People were just going to go ahead and either treat or they would test. And if the test was negative, they'll say, well, I know malaria. This is how it looks. And they would treat. And unfortunately, then what happens is not only can we develop chloroquine, we developed chloroquine resistance already. We could develop ACT resistance, but we also start to miss things like meningitis when it comes up. We miss Lassa fever in the early periods, in the early, 3-4 days of it. We miss Ebola because they all start off with a fever. Okay? So the issue then is, how do we get people to change their behavior? One of the things is to ensure that at the health facility or at the health post or at the pharmacy, wherever they go, is that they are offered a test first. People will be offered a test if the people who are offering the test trust the test, and this was our next big challenge. So in Africare, when we realized that the issue was, one, not trusting the tests and not trusting the results, not trusting the test to even do the right thing, and not trusting the results, well, we had this partner come in who introduced it to us, a card reader, diagnostic card reader, which works alongside a system. The card reader, you take and you slide the malaria test. It takes you step-by-step process through doing the test. And it eliminates the human error of putting either too much blood or too much of the reagent into the test. And it basically would take us from something like a 67% to like a 99%. So if you have a result, you can be certain 99% of the time that that result which is giving you is correct. If it says it's malaria, then it is malaria. If it says it's not malaria, it's not malaria. Look for something else. The other thing, of course, is that when children are young, because they are non-immune, you want to ensure that you treat the malaria on time. So we advocate for children to be taken to a health facility within 24 hours of having a fever, because they can die very quickly. Malaria does kill people. This is not a disease that you should trivialize. But if you're diagnosed within 24 hours, if a child is diagnosed within 24 hours, chances are we can get on top of it. I see your eyes all moving.
No,
we can carry on. Yes.
We're going to round up now.
Okay.
That was very important about malaria.
Yes.
The last question I want to ask you, and we've only got a few minutes
I
left.
actually wanted to make one more point.
Okay, please do.
So the advantage of having this reader, it's called the DECI reader, and its system, is that it has actually reduced our overtreatment by about 97% to about 2%. That's huge. That has huge cost implications for Nigeria. If we would adopt it countrywide, for example, we would significantly reduce the amount of money. So you reduced it
in the places
in the places where we worked, absolutely. 35 health facilities in 2 states.
Now, last question, and bear in mind we don't have that much time, is what does Africa need? what can the viewer who is watching this episode do to make the work of Africare in Nigeria easier?
I think that not just Africare now, but in general, when development practitioners are coming into your home, sort of a welcoming, which is sort of the first thing. But that's for viewers, right? So welcoming, listening, bring all your questions to the fore, and make sure you follow up if you have questions. Absolutely. Wider across the country, we want to continue to partner. We want to continue to partner with other NGOs. We want to continue to partner with other research institutions. We want to close the gaps where you have knowledge or information about something, you want to get it to the people. We're happy to be the go-between. We want to make sure that development continues to happen. And I think that for us, that's the most important thing.
Okay. It's been a pleasure having you on the Heart of the Matter, and I'm sure we would love to have you come in, either to talk about Africa or whatever else at some other time. So thank you ever so much for coming to be a blessing to us on the Heart of the Matter. And to you viewers, it's been our pleasure bringing this episode to you. We'll be back again next week with another episode of The Heart of the Matter. Until then, stay blessed.